And then this one?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now that it's the MIT and Harvard A+B meeting. So thank Mike Aziz and the Harvard team as well, but I really appreciate being here. And thank you all. This has sort of become the favorite go-to meeting for a whole variety of reasons that I'll try to highlight in a bit. I'm going to do quite a left turn from the previous talk, but not really. I'm going to try to focus on the interface of a lot of the energy sustainability science and policy. So I think to some of you it'll feel a far field, but actually I'm hoping that as kind of the talk goes on, you'll get a feeling for the way they're closely connected. And before I start, just to highlight, I really appreciated you putting, Curtis, the pictures of your students on each slide. I think I probably should start doing that. But I was going to ask the students from RAIL, our Renewable and Recovery Energy Laboratory. Whoops. Oh, okay. Got it. If I could just ask the students from the Renewable and Recovery Energy Laboratory that are here to stand up. There's a couple down front. I see a couple others. Just to highlight, I think there's 4 or 5 different talks and groups, and I highlight that because we have people doing essentially life cycle analysis, Kahui, people working on energy systems in Africa, looking at the environmental justice, job growth in the offshore wind area. So I'm hoping you'll get a chance to meet and talk with some of them. And since I've done A+B talks now several years in a row, one whole large area of our collaboration, and that's a multi-university, multi-laboratory effort anchored at Berkeley and at 5 different Chinese universities. I'm going to leave all of that out because I've talked about that in previous years, but catch me if you want to talk about some of the projects and opportunities on offshore wind, on electric vehicles, on solid state battery systems that we partner with a number of groups in Africa, in China. So I'll leave all of that aside and just kind of focus in on what I hope will be some very obvious, but also some kind of a new way to think about some of the opportunities. So I'm going to start with something that will seem very pedantic, and that is trying to frame justice as core a component of basic research, as the things that we're used to working on, be they power system models or chemistry of carbon sequestration or other topics, and then bring this back into kind of a dialogue with how we frame some of our projects. So I'll start off with this broad framing and then jump into some areas where, in quite practical ways in California, as part of what is now Justice 40, the federal effort in the United States, and some large partnerships in Africa, leaving aside the inclusive growth projects in China, which I won't cover in this talk. So then that'll move to the second part, I guess number 3 here, applying justice to work on energy systems. And so again, I think this is the one that everyone has seen and overseen, but I think what you heard was a really exciting part of the story about potential large-scale, non-environmentally damaging negative carbon pathways in Curtis's talk. But just to lay out how bad the landscape is today, our pathways and the various commitments that countries make at the annual climate meetings, we're now up to COP29, would only keep us at best in the perhaps 3 degrees C range. And then if you look at the most optimistic reading of different countries' NDCs, nationally defined contributions to the climate process, if you read everything in their favor and everything works out, that's a lot of if-then statements for any computer programmer, maybe you have a pathway that is 2.5 degrees C, and that's really if everything breaks the way people think on paper. And then the pledges and some of the optimistic targets would perhaps get us under 2. Many people think that window is very close to closed. And then again, what we need to do, and that is this dramatic decarbonization, and then what we just heard in Curtis's talk, and we'll see a lot of today in the carbon negative, carbon use strategies. We're going to have to build in this negative part of the story, and we are far on many of these fronts. All of that, the bad part of the story is that when we actually look at how far we are in practice from what people write down and heads of state and heads of research laboratories give talks about at international conferences, including next month, when Energy Week and the opening of the UN, UNGA, and all these things, there'll be wonderful proclamations, lots and lots of great thick reports, very glossy pages, highlighting how we're doing. But the reality is that we are still exceedingly stagnated. And so we can talk a great game, and at the end, I'll highlight a paper we just wrote called From PowerPoint to Power Plant, arguing what we're not getting right as of yet. So that kind of frames the degree to which all of the wonderful work that we're doing, some really cool advances, hopefully some more Nobel Prizes, lots of interesting company startups, these are not getting us on path, not on pace at all to get to our climate goals. And so part of the framing of this is that we're not meeting our climate goals. We're also not meeting our so-called sustainable development goals, these 17 different metrics. Energy access for everybody by 2030. We are roughly 800 million people away from that target today. Universal access to healthcare, gender equity and education, all great metrics. The number of those 17 metrics for which we are on track is tiny, disappointing. And in fact, if we break it out for those of you who have your SDGs memorized by number, most of us probably know SDG 7, that's the energy access, but healthcare equity, all the other ones, school equity, et cetera, we're doing terribly in terms of meeting these. Now, we have an economist in the room, we have many, and normally when you say take a hard problem, climate change, and add a constraint, and that constraint will be, let's actually do better on the SDGs, that would be a problem that would make the job worse. And so I'm a physicist, not an economist, and so I actually assert that adding justice as a constraint makes the climate problem easier. And so I want to try to highlight examples of where I think adding this constraint opens up opportunity, not only opens up markets, opens up areas of innovation that we would not otherwise explore. And if anything was kind of the intended takeaway from my talk, it would be, I think the more we look quantitatively, qualitatively too, but quantitatively at justice-focused goals, and I'll try to illustrate as we go, I think we actually make the climate problem as hard and difficult and dire as it is an easier one to solve. And I won't be able to prove that to you today, but I think that the evidence is trending in that very interesting direction. And so when I kind of think about where I start and some of the people I see in the audience start, and that is thinking about either clean energy supply to meet those goals, or how do we make energy accessible to those 800 million people who don't have access today? You know, I kind of do think about this spiral out from Sustainable Development Goal 7 to a whole bunch of other ones. And I understand that if I was a healthcare professional or if I was an education expert, I would probably put my own SDG at the center. For most of us, I think this is kind of a logical way to start. And I'll try to illustrate this both in industrialized country settings and in research laboratories and in emerging economy settings as I kind of move ahead in thinking about how do you not just talk about justice and equity, but actually make it part of the design process. And I understand that that is soft and squishy in some ways, but I'll try to illustrate some ways where I think we've actually done a reasonably good quantitative job building justice, not as something you apply after you do laboratory research, but something that you add into the equation as you start. And I think that's the really critical feature. There's a good friend of mine, Manuel Pastor, really a sociologist of energy transitions. He was at UC Santa Cruz, now he's at USC. And what he likes to say is that justice has to be baked in, not sprinkled on top. And I think if anything kind of encapsulates what I believe is the option to take the constraint of justice and make it core to what we do in the laboratory and beyond, I think that's really a great encapsulation of it. So just to get to the last bit of big theoretical framing, we also have to remember that if we look at emissions as a function of income around the planet, the richest 1% of the population responsible for more than 15%, the richest 10% of the world, over half of global emissions, and the poorest half of the planet, less than 10% of global emissions. So there is a massive inequality, and you can build out models. You guys have one that many people use in illustrating this here at MIT, and that is that if we think about this as some long-term convergence process, essentially the opportunity for the poorest people on the planet to grow their emissions by perhaps a factor of 3, if it is combined with the richest reducing their emissions dramatically, factor of 30, so more than order of magnitude, would still give us a convergence pathway and all of the kind of correctly framed negative talk about how far we are from achieving these climate goals. There are convergence pathways that if we accelerate innovation, bake in what I'm going to try to illustrate as this kind of core of justice thinking into our basic research, there are strategies that get us together. So, you know, in the Lord of the Rings speaking, all hope is not lost is kind of the message going forward. And as I drive through my town, Oakland, California, I get reminded this every day. This is a massive hanging banner on the side of a foundation highlighting the people who live in the zip code in Oakland that I live in, 94611. Life expectancy is kind of on the lower end of European life expectancies in Japan, but one Hamming distance away, one digit straight changed here to a part of West Oakland, a full 10 years different in life expectancy. That is, of course, not all due to energy, but that is symptomatic of the massive and very nearby inequalities that we see in lots of settings. And it's why I think this marriage of the climate story and the sustainable development, the justice story is so important and so real. So let me try to make some of that kind of lofty, not blah, 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 but unsecured in data approach more real in the process. And so I'll remind you of something that a lot of you know, many of you study who look at energy markets, and that is California's own path is an interesting one for a couple of reasons. One is that California is either the 4th or the 5th largest economy on the planet right now. Depends how you count what's going on in Germany and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of economic impacts. But California's 2010 goal for clean energy was to be 20% powered by clean energy. We missed that target. There was a party, ironically thrown, but that happened. We made the 2010 target of 20% powered by renewables in 2013. The goal for 2020 was 33%. California met that goal 3.5 years early. So in a 4-year window, kind of a incubation period, the amount of clean energy ramped up dramatically. And California does not count nuclear, nor does it count large hydro over 30 megawatts as a renewable. For interesting reasons we could discuss, and I'll leave those aside for now. In California, that at one point was planning on one nuclear plant every 25 miles along the coast, is down to one plant that will close in 2030, Diablo Canyon. So kind of a restricted definition. The goal for 2030 was to be 50% powered by renewables with a series of bills that have been passed. The 2030 goal has been increased to 60%, and I'll get to where we are in a second on that. So those numbers are interesting. They're illustrative of a large economy. Just to kind of put it in context, California is 42 million people, plus or minus 4. And so about half the population of Germany, and again, a GDP which is on par with Germany's. So those numbers are interesting. They don't illustrate justice right off, but a piece of California's climate law that I think is the one that's going to get the most attention when historians write their histories of this is that California committed 35% of its cap and trade revenues that are now about 12 or 13 billion a year to be spent on underserved, marginalized, fence line communities. That's a floor, not a ceiling on the expenditure. So I'll call that package Justice 35, because that's the way California framed the use of those funds. That, I think, is actually the most interesting aspect of a plan in the state, which is to be carbon neutral in 2045. A number of us are working on efforts to advance that date by 5 or 10 years. But I think it's that framing which is useful because it put into law and codified a lot of the work coming out of both the energy and climate research community, of which many of you have hopefully taken advantage of, California Energy Commission Air Resources grants. I see a number of recipients of those in the audience, but also the broader conversation around how do you do a clean climate energy system that reflects the justice equation in a much more central way. So there are many aspects of this. But one of the first ones, unfortunately, is being honest about where we are falling short. And California typically does two steps forward, and then often one big step backwards. We're engaged in a very bad effort right now, essentially partially trying to gut our solar and storage industry right at a time when it's doing some remarkable things, and I'll come back to that. So one aspect of being honest about where we're failing is an effort that a couple of us launched with Google some years ago, and that was to try to take on the issue that became very clear that in the way that many places in the world, California being an example, but not the only one, find ways to deploy solar are regressive. They are taxing the general population and essentially directing the money into people like me who tend to live in the nicer, more secure areas where we own our home, as opposed to programs that benefit renters, benefit low income businesses, et cetera. So this kind of dialogue over is solar only for the rich is something that in some places we like to think is in the rearview mirror. It is certainly not. We still have policy after policy that are often very good on a clean energy deployment basis, but don't actually do anything about this underlying injustice in the process. So with two postdocs at the time, Debbie Sunter is now a professor at Tufts after spending a year and a half in the Justice Office and in Department of Energy. Sergio Castellanos is at Texas Austin. We worked with Google to look at every solar rooftop in the country. That was possible because Google has an effort to basically scan all of your roofs for a variety of reasons. We won't get into why they're doing that. It's not all about solar, won't be a surprise to any of you. And why did we need to do this? One of the challenges is that you cannot actually go to each state or to the federal government and actually get a repository of where all the solar is. That seems bizarre. I mean, that's something you should be able to do right off. So we have to scan all rooftops, and actually when you scan for solar, it's not so easy because identifying skylights, there's quite a bit of machine learning. I'm going to skip over all that to identify and define what dark shapes on rooftops are solar or not. You'd like to just go look this up in a database, but you can't. And then a fair amount of processing to identify all that solar. We did that working with Google and then use census records to do the next part of the process, and that is to look at neighborhoods across the whole country and say who had solar and who does not have solar. And I think at one level, this result should surprise nobody. The first order result didn't surprise me, but the second order result really did. So we defined areas, not zip codes, but smaller areas as minority or majority based on 51% of the people living in that area being either there's no clear majority, it's clear white, a majority, or it's clear African American. There's not that many like that. The Asian Pacific Islander data is not on here. It wasn't significant, or Hispanic. And so we looked across the country at those areas. And what you find is that solar is more represented in areas where there's a white 51% or more majority. That's probably the result that doesn't surprise anybody here. What did surprise me, though, is that because we had access to income, what we found is over an order of magnitude of income from a family of four living below the poverty line, which is an embarrassingly small $26,000 a year, to almost an order of magnitude higher. What we found is that in white majority neighborhoods, solar is about 30 to 45% more prevalent than the green and an area where there is no racial majority. In Hispanic majority neighborhoods, it's about 40% less likely to have solar. And in African American majority neighborhoods, starts out about the same, but drops to about 80% less likely to have solar. And remember, that's in the context of lots of federal programs trying to invest in minority businesses. There's been a whole set of efforts, but those things have clearly not panned out in terms of a significant uptake in minority neighborhoods. And so right off, an area of so I would say dramatic failing given federal efforts in this area. This research became kind of a core part of of the birth process of what became a version of California's Justice 35, but now the official federal effort in this area, Justice 40. And Justice 40 is the effort to invest 40% of federal infrastructure spending in underserved, marginalized fence line communities. A program just until very recently run by Shalonda Baker from Northeastern and Tony Reams from Michigan. Both have just departed. But that effort is an example of trying to quantify a lot of these individual results. And so again, distilled message. So we've written extensively about it in terms of why are we making it so that the poorest among us commute the farthest in areas like around Route 128 here in Silicon Valley? The poorer you are, the farther you have to drive to be able to afford to live. And can we use efforts to deploy electric vehicles, for example, as an effort to build injustice? I won't get into the details of those, but these are some direct policy outcomes of that kind of work, including efforts to map zip codes in terms of their carbon footprint, looking at the lack of, not just the lack of accessible mass transit, but mass transit that's used by anyone but low-income people in a number of parts of the United States. And so this effort, this is a New York Times article highlighting the carbon footprints. And what you see in a lot of the data is that urban areas have lower carbon footprints than their suburbs, largely due to smaller living areas, less commuting distance, and of course, a number of these cities, I won't mention any in particular, for example, New York, that's won sustainability prize after prize, that conveniently does not include the suburbs because they have higher carbon footprint. You get a better number in these urban areas. And so being a little more honest about the data is one of the efforts that we tried to do in this carbon footprinting process, to highlight that there's an ecosystem built around some of these urban cores that we also have to reflect. And we have to actually look at the fact that a lot of the rich CEOs live in the suburbs and commute in some areas, like I was just in France, where there are places where you commute by helicopter. And so there are some real extreme versions of this kind of story. So just kind of trying to highlight how we can think about this process. On the one hand, there is some good progress in this area. So California was the first US state to launch a detailed environmental justice scoreboard. It's called PAL EnviroScreen. It's currently 23 or 24 distinct metrics that map inequality, that are used in state planning around that Justice 35, the spending of the funds. And that effort has led to programs at the federal level. There's EJ Screen, which is now a federal tool, and an increasing number of states taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Act, all now building their own environmental justice scoreboards. They tend to look fairly self-similar, just like lots of big machinery on the hardware side. Once you have a working model, it tends to get replicated over and over again. And so what you see in a lot of these state metrics and state tables are similar, not exactly the same, but are very similar across regions. And so there is some good news in kind of learning and getting down at these census tract levels and looking at how much inequality there is in different levels, and a whole bunch of aspects of this process. One of the aspects that is not directly due, but is partially due to this attention to justice, is that California and now Texas have done and I would say New York State now too, have done a kind of a remarkable job of recognizing that the pathway to clean energy has two or maybe three really difficult issues. One is that we need much more long duration storage. The kind of 4-hour lithium ion, lithium phosphate types of storage is great for some areas, but is nowhere near sufficient to allow utilities and industry to build out clean energy systems that they find comfortable utilizing. Comfortable meaning they can comfortably run their operations without, during times of winter or fires or other features, being able to run for longer periods. So all of you working on long duration storage, my hat's off, and we're going to need huge amounts more of it. But if you look at kind of an effort that kind of highlights to me some dramatic improvement, again, a New York Times coverage of the California story, this remarkable ramp up of solar and some wind, but solar in particular, but now adding significant amount of energy storage in the wings of that daily curve, so that you can meet power demand much more reliably longer term. Everything from flow batteries to the launch of hydrogen storage in some areas. I won't get into we just did some work on Japan and this, but also mechanical storage. One of the areas where we're collaborating with colleagues in China on gravity storage, be it water or rock, in efforts to give us very long duration dispatchable storage technologies. And so there's an interesting story here. Texas has now surpassed California in the amount of new storage coming onto the grid. It's a great version of the story. There's some hope that New York will be able to do the same. But again, it builds out this process of complementing the renewables with the needed amount of storage. In California, the battle right now is how to open up that story so that storage can be deployed in not just large industrial processes, but at smaller community scale efforts, so that underserved communities are also building that storage in. There's some efforts, and I'll give one or two kind of brief examples later on. One of the interesting examples of this is I think this is one of the charts that kind of blows me away. This is from earlier this year, and this is where we see power prices, because of the amount of renewables and flexing out this amount of storage, giving us power costs that, of course, are causing some headaches for our applied economist friends, but are giving us remarkable changes in the cost of power. Now, notice this is at 5 p.m., a peak solar time. So this is curated data, but similar story in Texas. But again, kind of a remarkable situation of being able to build out the amount of renewables plus the storage we'll need for some of the prime times. 5 o'clock, a peak demand time. But again, March is in Western US and California in particular, the good time of year. This is good solar, good wind, not massive heat as of yet. So again, kind of building out a picture of this broader picture. And again, I mentioned the work with Manuel Pastor as an effort to try to highlight we could do all of this much, much faster if we quantify and move forward some of those goals. So I want to pivot a little bit at that point, and highlight that the same analysis, the same look at what's happening in terms of not just the cost and availability curves of renewables, but also energy storage, allows us to think quite differently about applications. And so several of you in the room I see who were involved in the IPCC know this long, hard fought over graph. Some people in the IPCC process thought this was too social and normative to go into the IPCC. Finally, the effort was one to put in a graph or timeline to try to highlight where we are in the climate stripes picture, and highlighting that most of the people engaged in the process are somewhere between this age group and that age group, and that what we're really talking about is how do we think about the intergenerational equity part of the story for people who are not involved in crafting the IPCC goals, targets, and efforts, who are going to be living with the mess that we've all created. And so I want to frame this around how do we think hard about the same sorts of lessons that I just highlighted in the US with a focus on California in some emerging economies. And so let me highlight an example of a process. There'll be a talk tomorrow that Sam and Ryan, I don't see Ryan, are you in the room? Oh, Ryan's in the back from Duke University. But we'll be highlighting a concrete example of what I'm going to talk about next to kind of a broader high level. And that is an effort that was launched by USAID a couple of years ago when I was part of the team inside the federal government. And it's a very direct application of what I've just talked about. So what you see here is the power grid in Africa as circa 2021. And then all of these dots, and some people tell me these are green and some tell me they're blue. Whatever they are, I think is a function of the age of your eyes and which kind of color blindness you have. But these are all health clinics across Africa. And so this effort, originally called Powering Health, which is now called HEDA, Health, Electrification, Telecommunications Alliance, is an effort to identify and to utilize the power demand at health clinics across Africa as hubs of mini grids across the continent. So there's about 170,000 health clinics across Africa, and about 100,000 of them either don't have power at all, or have power that's too intermittent to be useful and reliable, or have power that they can't afford. So HEDA came about as an effort to try to recognize that clinics, if they're powered, have a fairly steady demand for power. They are essentially ideal anchor clients for mini grids that will power them. But because of the low cost of renewables and the increasingly low cost of energy storage, remember, solar and energy storage costs have declined 90% in the past decade. Wind costs have declined about 60%, but focusing generally on solar and energy storage, although other technologies are possible. The idea is to use those clinics as hubs of this process. And so the component of USAID that's focused on energy demands in Africa, called Power Africa, the division that I was in when we got this launched, is looking at a timeline to build out partnerships to build clean energy systems at those mini grids. And so the goal is everything from some of the smallest clinics. Here's a company that Sam and colleagues have studied, in particular in Rwanda. I can never quite tell, Boston, Rome, Kigali partnership. It's a little complicated to know where actually this company Off-Grid Box is based. But some of their smaller units, it's essentially a mini grid in a shipping container. The solar panels, the bus, the battery systems, Wi-Fi generators, water purification are packed into the box that is then dropped in and then built out to power smaller clinics, but also larger ones as well, to power the cold chain, to power equipment for operating rooms, for neonatal centers, et cetera. And again, you'll hear a lot about this tomorrow. So please come to Sam and Ryan and other student colleagues talk. And so this is an effort to look at what can we do to build out that timeline. So as of a year and a half ago, there was just under 2,000 clinics that were across all of Africa that were inside the tent. They were either being monitored for their power demand, or these solar systems had been built out and deployed by a quite complex consortium of governments, the US government, German government, Danish government, anchor partners, a whole range of private sector companies, from some very small companies to some of the biggest cell phone providers, Rolls-Royce, very large companies as well, and then a whole range of UN agencies, all involved in a process to jointly fund the efforts to build out these clinics with the basic model. And this is really a stripped down version. The international consortium wants to pay for the CapEx for these mini grid systems, but the host governments or ministries of health are required to cover the operating, the OpEx. And whether that's through diesel savings or other businesses that are possible, that covering those costs going forward is the commitment you make to get the CapEx investment in your host country. And so I'm giving one example of kind of a fascinating success story, is the story of what may or may not still be true, but as of last year, the largest mini grid that I'm aware of in Africa. But Sam, who just came back from the Congo, may be able to correct me. This is in Goma in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is an effort put in by a mini grid developer that is now done well enough to have an expanded profile called Nuru. And what you see is an effort within the city of Goma, a place served by a complex mix of utilities and has complex challenges in terms of rebels and in terms of lava flows and in terms of a whole variety of challenges in the area. But essentially, the story here is very, very poor quality power in a system before. This is voltage, massive voltage frequency fluctuations on the grid, which not only means it's not reliable, but it means that equipment, medical and otherwise, has dramatically reduced lifetimes from this incredible range of voltage and of frequency. And I believe Sam and Ryan will talk about some of the frequency variations tomorrow in their talk. But shorting out equipment way ahead of lifetime, When the solar went in, you can see a kind of a dramatic change from this kind of impossible voltage frequency destruction of hardware to a system where much more stable. And as a result of the success of the process and the degree to which it attracted other funders, a initially planned 1.1 megawatt mini grid is now on path to become a 5 megawatt mini grid, backed up with energy storage, not only serving clinics and schools, but now actually selling power in the region beyond. And so it's an example of this process kind of snowballing and serving some of the least well-served people in the area. Again, everything from the very small clinic in a box that you saw, that off-grid box. This is an. Did I hit my time? Okay. Did I press the wrong button? I didn't need to. Yeah. Okay. And so there's an example of slightly larger clinics that have received solar and IT systems to provide monitoring technology. These are in Eswatini in Southern Africa. Again, examples of a little bit larger and smaller clinics as part of this process. And this is part of a larger effort to identify and to utilize clean energy systems, not only to power these clinics, but also to build out a larger and larger community of researchers. And so one of the efforts that we worked on with a team at University of Waterloo was an effort to try to bring the excitement of working in this area. Of course, all of you are already converts because you're here already, but to try to bring it to a larger community. And so after much sort of controversy, the IEEE devoted a special issue to looking at these sustainability opportunities in building out systems, from these solar battery ones I highlighted to a number of efforts to build much more sustainable micro hydro systems. This is an effort taking place in Southeast Asia to try to build out systems to not only provide the kind of energy access I highlighted already, but also to work with efforts that initially planned lots and lots of large downstream and upstream dams, but to make that effort focusing on smaller run-of-the-river hydro projects, more upstream projects, less of these huge, in this case, Mekong-altering downstream projects, as an example to try to bring in more and more of the electrical engineering community into what we all do here. And so, again, I want to highlight that and sort of just identify the last point I mentioned at the beginning, how we have to be honest about our failings and to try to find ways to quantify those. So one of the areas that I won't get into in detail is this kind of discussion about the so-called duck curve. And here the artist has made the duck into, I guess, a plesiosaur. So this is the dinosaur duck, but of course, birds are dinosaurs. But for all of people who have worked on the market side of the process, we're all either keenly aware of the fear, the worry that utilities worldwide have over the duck curve, the idea that as we install more and more solar, that's great on one metric, but on the other metric, what it does is it brings down the marginal value of adding more solar unless you can find, I keep doing the wrong thing there, I'm sorry, unless you can identify not just good theoretical, but a practical ways to deploy that. So this is the California version, and California just hit a milestone where for 100 straight days, California has now been able to export renewable energy to its neighbors, either from minutes to hours, in one case, 13 straight hours during the day. But again, as we install massive amounts of solar, and we're now more than 20 gigawatts of distributed solar in California, meaning almost enough to meet our average demand, not the peak August demand that can be more than double that, but the average demand. So one of the areas, of course, is strategically charging electric vehicles at the time of these peak power. And I think Charles will be talking about the nuclear's role in possibly doing this as well. But then also, if there is a ideal use case for hydrogen, it's also utilizing this clean energy supply. I'm not going to talk about over-generation of renewables. I don't think that's a possibility. But this underutilized clean energy resource to produce green hydrogen is an opportunity. And we'll hear a fair amount about hydrogen. Again, we just came out with a study of Japan as a use case where, for all of my reservations around hydrogen being the magic fuel, I do think in the Japanese case, there's a huge opportunity to make hydrogen a major part of their transition strategy. Last point I want to make is just to remind us where we are and how much quantifying these goals and then finding ways to work on them is a key part of the process. So in November last year, Presidents Xi and Biden signed the incredibly well-named Sunnylands Agreement. They found a small town in California, Sunnylands, to sign this agreement. And this is a commitment to triple the amount of renewable energy in use globally by 2030. China is the only country right now which is arguably on pace domestically to get there, but has challenges in terms of many of its overseas investments. And just to kind of highlight what that means for all of the wonderful growth of renewables that you've all taken part in, that exceptional growth, and it's truly exceptional, 90+% of all new energy deployments worldwide last year and the year before were renewable. So there's something to cheer about there. But all of that good news more or less adds up to a doubling of the amount of deployed renewables by 2030. The Sunnylands Agreement is for a tripling domestically, but also tripling around the rest of the world. And sadly and fairly scarily, this green bar represents that missing 1/3 of our clean energy mix by 2030. And unfortunately, it's almost exactly the size of the total global deployed renewable energy today. So if you think about by how much we are currently scheduled to miss our 2030 target, it's equal to everything we've done cumulative to this point. And so if anything could be sobering, and that's why this paper is called From PowerPoint to Power Plant, trying to scale up all of these efforts. And again, that's the signing ceremony for the Sunnylands Agreement. So thank you so much. I hope that wasn't too much of a step away, but I hope it tried to integrate for many of you how the design process around clean energy deployment and justice is kind of a co-equal and a partner with what we think about often on the tech-only basis. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nice. One question. Also, a lot of operating on South China like race. And 80% of the country are behind on the 11 games, which is what we call it 75 down there. You come around in California here, but in the cost is delivered really bad swing.
No. Okay. Thanks. I did the same thing again. Now let's see if it'll let me go back. There we go. So Charles is unfortunately right on the money here. California is not doing well in terms of delivering at low cost. California used to be able to say that we had some of the highest utility rates in the country in terms of cost per kilowatt hour, but some of the lowest overall bills because of being a leader on energy efficiency. And that's been eroded dramatically in the process. The good news is that California has now deployed a massive amount of solar behind the meter. So homeowners in California have done exceedingly well. There is no longer any subsidy that exists for deploying solar. There is a subsidy if you do solar and storage, and so building out the wings of the curve and building out a more reliable grid is part of that story. Ironically, Californians are not able to capture the financial benefits of that. So right now, except for some very small historic pockets, you cannot sell power back. Hawaii, as you mentioned, you can now sell power back at a low, kind of just above wholesale, but you can sell power back. But in California, you can bank power. So if you're a homeowner or a small business owner, you can zero your net bill over the year. But if you can't make any money selling power back, then almost nobody wants to overbuild the solar system like I highlighted in this Africa story, because the best you can do is zero your bill out. The battle going on right now, and I alluded to it really briefly, is one that would fight back against this effort that doesn't allow people to sell power back in. And by people, I mean businesses and homeowners. Right now, the California Solar and Storage Association is leading the charge in front of our Public Utilities Commission, which has taken a very, very anti-justice perspective on doing exactly that. Most of the assessments are if we unlock that 20 plus gigawatts of distributed solar and now storage and allowed payments back to individuals, housing associations, apartment buildings, so that the apartment building owner and the renters co-shared this process, so-called solar gardens laws, we could actually do a huge amount to bring that rate down. But this is exactly why California is not, it's the golden state, but it's not the golden economic state, I would argue, at the moment. So great question and some unanswered.
It's fine, I can just say.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Yes. And I worked with the rare disease that to trade the geography about. I was wondering, so you talk about the need for quantifying and I was wondering what the papers are that displaying this entity is, for instance, really and planetize it as in fundamental contradiction. And I run the study and use metrics of a kind. A dollar spent at a higher income level is less intensive than one at a lower level, or metrics of a kind of GHG emissions that we require to live this many billions of people out of poverty are this much. So I was wondering what your thought is on this metrics.
so this is a great question. There's a lot packed into what you asked, right? So on the one hand, many international development projects funded by the World Bank or the regional development banks have used the argument that large fossil projects are, they may not be great for the planet, but they are a good approach to bring energy to the poor. A project that I was involved in analyzing and fighting against when I was at the World Bank now 14 years ago was the Medupi project, a huge coal project in South Africa. And the US ultimately and the Netherlands voted to, well, they didn't, but they abstained, which is kind of a weak version. But essentially that project was analyzed and analoged as a flagship model of large fossil for a country that has very poor power quality and has huge numbers of people that don't have access. It was highlighted in extent Lee, who works a lot in South Africa, I know knows the story well. And ultimately, Medupi was passed because of a promise to not only build this 4 gigawatt coal complex, but to also launch a series of solar projects as well. The solar projects did not happen. The national utility, which I believe is the 5th largest utility in the world, Eskom, is now at least 25 billion US dollars in debt, and that's a conservative number. And ultimately, almost none of that coal-fired power went to poor individuals. It largely went to pre-existing South African industry. So our large-scale process, I would argue, largely doesn't work on this. The reason why I kind of highlighted this HEDA project is because I think it's one that does work on this, and that we do know that addressing communities that are reliant on diesel power or are reliant on very small individual off-grid solar systems is an area where you can actually, for a very, very good carbon signature, bring many more people into a clean energy economy. And so as an example, Kenya, which has for a long time has been a leader in Africa on mobile money, something called M-Pesa. For a long time, the largest client of M-Pesa was in fact the booming distributed off-grid solar industry. That has now changed as it's matured, but it's an example of getting to the issue you're talking about. So do I think our policies are aligned around a pro-SDG mandate? Absolutely not. Do I think there's emerging examples where through this combination of the cost declines of clean energy and really leveraging very hard information technology, sensors, can we do a vastly different job? I think the answer is yes. And that's why I highlighted with this project in Goma as an example of an effort. Interestingly, one of the key partners in that effort to build that largest mini grid in Africa has now shifted almost all their business to working with US utilities to try to get the same IT smartness into what's going on at US utilities that they essentially pioneered in the DRC. So a very incomplete answer, but it's a really interesting and I would say optimistic case of leveraging these techs.
Yes, John Valentine, Brand. I just wanted to follow up on your environmental justice and World Bank example in that, as you know, the many of that first, everything else, talk about tripling the amount and building sustainability in there.
Yep.
And I guess as I look at this, it's really, you're talking about a heterogeneous world of finance and everything else. So how is the World Bank solutions the right way to go, or should we kind of delve into, you know, a series of different parts of the world that have very different priorities and perspectives and tremendous needs and very different. California is one thing,
Yep.
Africa is another. Situations could be maybe more grant-based, less, you know, market-based. You know the part.
Yeah. Well, I think that like Curtis's answer to the great question from over here, I think that you answered your own question to a very large degree. I would actually argue, though, that the situation in California, the situation in Spain and the UK is not so different, actually, than the situation in a lot of these emerging economies, in the sense that the places that have really worked hard to leverage clean energy technology, instrumentation to document and verify, and financing have worked pretty well. So I actually don't think that grants are actual or gifts are the answer here. I think it's really building out more sustainable versions of the story. One example of that that I think gets too little press is that on President Biden's first full day in office, among that huge stack of executive orders he signed, one of them was to institute a social cost of carbon. And, you know, short version of the story, if the market price of carbon in California is about $35, it's about $39 or $40, like in the latest ETS in the European Union. I think only Sweden, any Swedes in the audience, has a market price of carbon that's over 100 US dollars a ton. The social cost of carbon calculated out to be at minimum about 150 and possibly as high as $300, depending on the assumptions. This is the David Antoff, Berkeley plus RFF and others work on the topic. I would argue that is a mechanism. And so whether we peg our federal programs, and President Biden tried to peg contracts with the federal government to the social cost of carbon, not to a cap and trade or a carbon tax number, that would be one way to go. The World Bank, when I was there 15 years ago, made the bold step to say we're going to utilize a $20 cost of carbon. That number has crept up, but incredibly slowly in terms of internal analysis. And whenever they get, and I don't want to pick on the World Bank here only, but whenever they get to a tricky case, like the Medupi case, they throw it out. They say, well, this is an exceptional case. We don't want to use our metrics in this effort. So I would say a little more honesty about those metrics would be a good start in doing exactly that. But to me, as a physicist, not economist, advocating for a social cost of carbon would be a logical way to go, at least for being honest about the projects that we take on and those that we choose not to to enforce our standards. That's at least telling something about we have another metric or we've been diverted by other issues. The other number I want to put up is that every year the same heads of state that go to these big climate conferences, they highlight what their countries are doing, and often they're quite impressive. The total global investment in clean energy infrastructure. So investing in real things, wind turbines, solar panels, heat pumps, totals up to about 3 trillion per year. And these same heads of state that champion what they're doing in this area, the total annual subsidy, not the capex, but the subsidy for fossil fuels is estimated to be 7 trillion. So in terms of capex versus a subsidy added, I would argue that's the other part of the story that we're just not talking about. And that is, unless we find a way to disentangle and move away from this, you keep ramping this up, but our subsidies for fossil are larger than our total investment in renewables, then this curve doesn't mean a whole lot, because what it means is that we're adding green as kind of a nice green veneer around a very large fossil fuel ball inside. So kind of a philosophical answer, but I think you opened the door to that a little bit.
Question? Okay,
Okay. Comes the South Africa expert, so.
Well, it's truly remarkable, I would say, component range from activities. But I catch you early on by saying you were gonna tell us how it's easy to solve climate by incorporating justice. I think you're the only one who knows, but I.
Okay. So unfortunately, that means I fail. No, that's actually kind of good feedback. So what I tried to highlight, both in the example of California's investment in justice and the ramping up of clean energy, with your worry about rates a true issue, and in the case of deploying clean energy at health clinics as hubs of potentially 100,000 mini grids, are both examples, to me anyway, of investing in clean energy, but with a specific focus on non-energy outcomes. So this idea around investing in health clinics is energy in the service of health, not energy in the service of climate, because the primary metric for how that energy is deployed is changes in healthcare. You'll hear about tomorrow in the talk that Sam and Ryan will give, using direct metrics on patient outcomes, retention of staff, using health clinics as educational hubs as an example of the process. And definitely in California, the investment in marginalized communities has been the biggest single change in our effort. And I would argue that's where we've seen the most growth. So California, again, which can now meet its average energy demand just with distributed behind the meter solar, is a resource that transforms the equation. The fact that we still don't know how to manage our utilities in a way. And to be honest, one utility, Southern California Edison, has been a leader in trying to find opportunities, except that they don't do what I hope to the economists seems like the obvious thing. If you're going to deploy all this, at least let those deployed sources of clean energy sell it back, not just bank it and at the end of the year to decide, have you donated energy to the utility, or do you have to pay them a bill? And right now, Californians pay a true up. So solar on rooftops of homes or businesses, my house being one example, at the end of the year, if I've over put money into my utility bank, that was my donation to the utility. If I've under put in, I pay a true up to bring my payment up to what it should have been, because I didn't put in 100% of my annual demand for energy into their bank. And so again, those are examples of where I think that the justice story is clear. If I didn't make it a strong enough connection, my apologies.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you.
我们考后期啊，奥赛我们要是有回答能为你们他们那个说的，就是说那个可以说的话，对，都不对。Yeah, that's right.